The night I returned to the old Naval Museum in Port Avalon, I expected nothing more than an awkward family dinner celebrating my younger brother Ethan's appointment to a prestigious command. But when the museum's director suddenly stopped beside my table and addressed me by the operational name I had buried 12 years earlier, the conversation around us died so completely that I could hear rain tapping against the enormous glass windows overlooking the harbor. And my brother's proud smile disappeared as he realized the quiet woman he had spent years treating like the least remarkable person in our family had apparently lived an entire life none of them had ever bothered to ask about. I had arrived wearing a simple navy blue dress beneath my old service coat, intending to congratulate Ethan, shake my parents' hands, endure their endless comparisons, and leave before anyone could ask why I had spent so many years refusing to discuss my military career. Because after a decade of watching my family celebrate Ethan's medals, promotions, rescue missions, and heroic stories while describing my own service as administrative work. I had learned that sometimes silence was easier than explaining something to people who had already decided what you were capable of. Ethan had always been the bright star in our family sky, the child who collected attention without ever having to ask for it. And that evening, his promotion ceremony had transformed the museum's historic exhibition hall into a glittering celebration filled with senior officers, journalists, former commanders, and family friends who listened eagerly as my father told anyone who would stand still that his son had inherited the courage our family had always been known for, while my mother proudly displayed photographs of Ethan receiving awards and laughing beside famous commanders, as though every frame proved that her favorite child had finally become the person everyone expected him to be. I stayed near the back with a glass of sparkling water, smiling whenever someone spoke to me and allowing my family to introduce me as Claire Morgan, Ethan's older sister, who used to work in military logistics. Even though the truth was that I had spent years coordinating emergency extraction teams, designing crisis response simulations, and quietly training specialists who operated in places where mistakes were measured in lives rather than disappointing performance reviews. But I had never corrected the story because the work had required discretion, and somewhere along the way I had become strangely comfortable watching people underestimate me. The turning point came when Commander Elias Hart, a retired intelligence officer who now supervised advanced leadership programs for the Atlantic Defense Institute, walked onto the stage to congratulate Ethan and unexpectedly asked whether the audience remembered the North Star Protocol, an emergency response framework developed after a disastrous multinational exercise years earlier that had become a standard training model across several Allied commands. And when Ethan confidently laughed and said, "Of course, sir, everyone knows North Star," Hart looked directly at me before answering. "Then perhaps you should introduce your sister properly, because she was the architect who rebuilt that protocol after original system failed." My mother's face went to blank. My father slowly lowered the glass in his hand and Ethan stared at me as if I had suddenly spoken another language, while Hart continued explaining that the woman standing quietly beside the last row of chairs had once been known inside specialized training circles as North Star, the officer who had redesigned an entire crisis response system after surviving a failed operation, and then spent years teaching others how to recognize danger before it became disaster. And for the first time in my life, I watched my family discover that my silence had never meant I had nothing to say. Ethan pulled me aside after the applause faded, his expression caught somewhere between anger, embarrassment, and disbelief, and he demanded, "Why did you never tell me any of this?" So I answered honestly that I had tried more than once, but every attempt had been swallowed by conversations about his achievements, his deployments, his medals, or the next important step in his career. And I reminded him of the evening I had returned from an overseas assignment, and my father had interrupted me halfway through a story to ask whether I had heard that Ethan had been selected for an elite leadership course. Because after enough years of being interrupted, redirected, and quietly dismissed, I had stopped trying to force my way into rooms where nobody seemed interested in making space for me. Ethan looked away for several seconds before admitting that he had always assumed I had chosen a quiet life because I lacked the ambition he possessed. And I told him that was the difference between being unseen and being unremarkable, because I had never needed applause to do difficult work, while he had spent years believing that if nobody applauded him, the achievement itself somehow became smaller. What Ethan did not know, however, was that Commander Hart had not come to the celebration merely to reveal my old professional identity, because 3 months earlier he had contacted me privately after a serious leadership failure during Ethan's latest command evaluation and asked whether I would consider helping him before the mistake followed him into a permanent assignment. And the reason was not that Ethan lacked courage or technical ability, but that he had developed a dangerous habit of making decisions quickly, dismissing contradictory information, and treating questions from junior officers as challenges to his authority instead of warnings that could save lives. I had initially refused because I wanted no part in repairing a relationship my family had spent years allowing to become competitive, but Hart told me something that stayed with me. You are not being asked to rescue your brother, Claire. You are being given the chance to decide whether your knowledge should become another wall between you or a bridge neither of you expected. And 3 days later, Ethan appeared at my apartment without his uniform, his awards, or his usual confidence, carrying a battered notebook and quietly saying, I think I finally understand why they sent me to you. For the next several months, I refused to treat Ethan like a little brother and instead treated him like every other officer who had ever walked into my training room believing talent could compensate for arrogance. So I challenged his assumptions, forced him to explain decisions he normally made instinctively, placed him in simulations where the obvious answer was deliberately wrong, and made him sit in silence while junior team members questioned his plans until he learned that leadership was not the ability to speak first, but the discipline to listen when everyone else was afraid to disagree. The transformation did not happen quickly, and there were arguments when Ethan accused me of enjoying his mistakes, moments when he walked out furious, and one unforgettable afternoon when he threw his notebook onto my desk and shouted, You have spent your whole life waiting for the chance to prove you were better than me, only for me to answer calmly, No, Ethan, I spent my whole life hoping you would eventually realize that I was never competing with you. And that sentence finally broke through something neither of us had been willing to confront because he began to understand that my greatest achievement was not the secret reputation Commander Hart had revealed, but the fact that, despite years of being overlooked, I had never wished for his failure. A year later, Ethan stood before a new group of officers at a coastal training center outside Briarhaven and delivered a speech that surprised everyone who knew the man he had once been, because instead of listing his medals or describing his victories, he spoke about the people who had challenged his judgment, the junior officers who had taught him to listen, and an older sister whose quietness he had once mistaken for weakness. And when he finally looked toward the back of the room where I was standing, he said, The person who changed my career never asked me to become more impressive. She taught me to become more responsible, which was the first public acknowledgement I had ever received from him that did not make me feel like someone's forgotten shadow, but simply like Claire, his sister, a professional and a woman who no longer needed her family to discover her worth before she could believe it herself. That evening after the ceremony, my father approached me without asking about secret missions or impressive stories and simply said, I spent years thinking the loudest achievements were the most important ones, and I was wrong. While my mother took my hand and apologized for every introduction that had reduced my life to Ethan's sister, and I realized that some wounds do not disappear because someone finally says sorry, but they can begin to heal when people stop defending the past and start behaving differently in the present. And that was enough for me because I had finally learned that being overlooked had never made me invisible. It had only given me the freedom to become someone who did not need an audience to know her own value. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.